ført en kamp imod en bestialsk modstander. Men alligevel en modstander, og han i nogen grad vidste, hvor man havde, og hvilke hensigter han havde. Den såkaldt hjemmefront har ført kamp mod en modstander, hvis lige er døden, og de værvende ender af Østfront.
Jeg har ikke meget tid nu. Der fortæller jeg noget, hvor jeg er travlt. Og skulle det ske, og hente nogen af jer sker noget, så sørger jeg med jer, og et trøst kan jeg give jer, det er de falder fra Danmarks ære.
A man steps on a mine in a Russian swamp and loses his leg at the hip. He is dead before anyone can reach him. He was the commanding officer of a Danish SS formation fighting on the Eastern Front. His replacement is killed 9 days later. The replacement after that lasts one afternoon. Over 300 Danes are dead before the summer ends. The survivors, gaunt and depleted, are shipped home to Denmark. This is what it looked like to fight for the crusade. 6,000 Danes served in the Frikorps Danmark across the course of the war. 12,000 volunteered in total. Half were turned away as unsuitable. In a country of 4 million people, 12,000 men raised their hand when they were told there was a Danish formation being raised to fight the Soviets on the Eastern Front. 77 of them were officers of the Royal Danish Army. The entire Danish army before the war had numbered 6,600 men. Think about that ratio for a moment before any other question gets asked. Were they crusaders? Were they quislings? The evidence is here, you decide. Denmark did not fall the way France fell. It did not fall the way Poland fell. It did not fall through weeks of grinding combat, a national catastrophe, and armies broken across a continent. Denmark fell in 6 hours. German forces crossed the southern border in the early morning, and by the time most Danes had dressed and understood what the radio was telling them, the military decision had already been made on their behalf. In Copenhagen, German soldiers were in the streets before the government had issued a single order of resistance. German warships had entered the harbour under cover of darkness. The capitulation was signed the same day, 6 hours. For a country that had remained outside the First World War entirely, that had built its national identity over generations on principled neutrality and careful diplomacy between great powers, those 6 hours were not merely a military defeat. They were a rupture in the national self-understanding that reached into places that military defeats alone do not usually reach. The Netherlands had its 5 days. Norway had its 2 months of resistance before the government fled. Denmark had 6 hours and a signed surrender. The shame of that, the particular texture of that shame, shaped everything that followed in ways that are impossible to separate from the story of the men who eventually chose to go east. The terms of the occupation that followed were unusual enough to deserve close attention, because they produced the specific political environment that made the Frikorps possible. Denmark retained its king. Christian X remained on the throne, riding his horse through Copenhagen every morning in a gesture of quiet defiance that the Germans tolerated because it cost them nothing. The elected government retained its authority, or what remained of it. The parliament continued to sit. The courts continued to function. The entire administrative machinery of Danish life continued to operate in Danish hands. The German diplomat Cecil von Renther-Fink arrived as Reichsbevollmächtigter, the imperial plenipotentiary, to supervise Danish affairs, but he supervised a machinery that had not been dismantled. This was an occupation in the sense that Poland had experienced it, where a functioning state was replaced by a German administration governing a conquered population. This was something more ambiguous and more corrupting than that. Denmark was a functioning state operating inside a German cage, and the central political question facing its leadership from April 1940 onward was how much of Danish life could be preserved through accommodation before the accommodation became indistinguishable from the thing it was accommodating. The Danes called this policy forhandlingspolitik, negotiation politics, the idea that by engaging constructively with German requirements, by meeting demands before they became ultimatums, Denmark could protect its population from the worst of what occupation meant elsewhere. It was a rational calculation, and in many specific respects it worked. What the forhandlingspolitik framework produced, alongside its genuine protections, was a political culture in which the line between accommodation and collaboration was genuinely difficult to locate. The Commander-in-Chief of the Danish Army, General William Pryor, spent the occupation years attempting to preserve Danish military integrity within an arrangement that made that progressively harder to define. He failed in several specific cases. The most significant failure, from the perspective of this documentary, was his inability to prevent Danish army officers from volunteering for service in a German formation and receiving official permission to do so. Inside Danish society, alongside the accommodators and the reluctant collaborators and the small minority of genuine resistors, there was a faction that had been waiting for precisely the kind of moment the occupation represented. The DNSAP, Denmark's National Socialist Workers' Party, had existed since 1930 under the leadership of Frits Clausen. Clausen was a country doctor from Boverup in southern Jutland, a region with a historically significant German-speaking minority, a man of the provincial professional class whose anti-communism and pan-Germanic ideology had found a genuine, if limited, audience in Depression-era Denmark. The DNSAP shared the racial framework, the anti-Semitism, the anti-communism, and the vision of a reordered European politics dominated by fascist states. Clausen was, at least initially, a Danish nationalist as well as a national socialist. He wanted a Denmark that cooperated with Germany and found its place in a German-led European order. He did not want a Denmark absorbed into the Reich. He wanted recognition as the political leader of a specifically Danish national socialist movement with a specifically Danish future. The movement grew through the 1930s. By 1935, the DNSAP had approximately 50,000 members and was drawing meaningful electoral support in regional elections. That figure is worth sitting with for a moment. In a functioning democracy with a free press and strong civil institutions, 1 in 12 Danish voters had at some point chosen a fascist party at the ballot box. Clausen was not a figure operating in a political cellar. He was a visible public figure who spoke the language of order, discipline, national renewal, and anti-communism to an audience that found that language compelling. The mainstream parties watched the DNSAP's growth with alarm and responded with increasing political and social pressure. After 1935, the party's electoral support declined. Its rhetoric became more explicitly anti-Semitic in ways that pushed many ordinary Danes away. By the eve of the German invasion, the movement was in retreat electorally, but it retained its core membership, its organisational structure, its newspaper, and its network of true believers who had been waiting for the political landscape to shift. Beyond the DNSAP, there was a more diffuse but in some respects more ideologically committed tendency in Danish right-wing politics. Where Clausen was a Danish nationalist who happened to be a national socialist, there were men in Danish political circles whose primary commitment was to the idea of Germanic racial community, the vision that the Danes, the Germans, the Norwegians, the Flemish, and the other northern European peoples constituted a single natural community temporarily divided by the historical accidents of state formation. For these men, Danish sovereignty was not a value to be preserved. It was an obstacle to be overcome in the realization of something larger. The occupation had not humiliated them. In their framework, it had brought them home. This distinction within Danish fascism matters because it shaped the Frikorps from its first days. The men who came to the formation through the DNSAP and through pan-Germanic conviction were not the same men as the professional soldiers who came through the Danish army's accommodation framework, and they were not the same men as the younger volunteers who came through anti-communist conviction without strong prior political affiliation. The Frikorps Danmark was not an ideologically uniform formation. It was a formation defined by a shared destination and shaped by motivations that had arrived there by different routes. The invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 changed the terms of everything. 3 German army groups drove east along a front of nearly 2,000 kilometers. The opening weeks appeared to justify the most optimistic projections the German High Command had made. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the first days. Cities fell. The road to Moscow appeared open. For the SS's recruitment apparatus in the occupied countries of Western Europe, the invasion was the moment of opportunity the entire ideological architecture of National Socialism had been constructed to produce. The war against the Soviet Union was not, in the framework that Himmler and the SS had spent a decade building, a military campaign in the conventional sense. It was the defining struggle of European civilization against Asiatic Bolshevism. It was the crusade. anti-communism was the most broadly shared ideological conviction across the European right in 1941, and it operated well beyond the boundaries of committed fascism. The Spanish Civil War had already established the template, nationalist Christian Europe against godless Soviet power, and millions of Europeans who had no particular attachment to National Socialist racial theory accepted that template as an honest account of what the Eastern War represented. The SS's recruiters understood this. The framing they used in occupied Western Europe was not primarily about racial community. The primary framing was the crusade. Come and defend Europe, come and fight the thing that everyone who thinks clearly agrees is the greatest threat to everything European civilization has built. 7 days after Barbarossa began, on the 29th of June 1941, Fædrelandet ran the announcement on its front page. The Frikorps Danmark was open for recruitment. The announcement described the Frikorps as a Danish volunteer formation organised to fight alongside Germany against the Soviet Union. It framed the Frikorps as a Danish contribution to a European cause, which allowed men who were not committed National Socialists to understand their participation in terms that did not require them to identify as such. This framing was deliberate and it was effective. It reached men who would not have responded to a straightforwardly SS recruitment call, and it allowed the DNSAP, which was the formation's primary organising force, to present itself as the vehicle of a national effort rather than a party project. The Danish government's response to the Frikorps announcement is one of the most consequential and most disputed aspects of the entire occupation period, and it requires careful treatment because it is the thing that makes the Danish case unlike any other foreign volunteer formation that fought for Germany in the Second World War. The government did not refuse, it did not condemn, it did not attempt to prevent recruitment through any mechanism available to it. Instead, it authorised officers of the Royal Danish Army to take leave of absence and serve in the Frikorps. Career officers were formally guaranteed that their Danish rank would be preserved and their pension rights protected when they returned. Official government and military representatives attended the departure ceremony when the first contingent of volunteers left Danish soil for training in Germany. Danish Foreign Minister Erik Scavenius entered into a formal agreement with the Reichsbevollmægtigte that officers and soldiers of the Royal Danish Army wishing to join would be granted leave and allowed to retain their rank. The Danish cabinet issued an official announcement naming Crissing as commander with the consent of the Royal Danish government. General Pryor tried to prevent his officers from enlisting. He failed. Some Danish historians have described this governmental response as sanction. Others have described it as reluctant acknowledgement of a situation the government lacked the political leverage to prevent. The distinction between those two interpretations is real and it matters, but it has never been fully settled. What is not in question is that the Frikorps Danmark was unique among all the foreign volunteer formations that fought for Germany across occupied Europe. The Norwegian Legion had been organised by Quisling's National Samling, which most Norwegians considered a collaborationist disgrace. The Flemish and Walloon legions in Belgium were assembled through local fascist movements with no governmental standing. The Dutch Volunteer Legion had no formal state endorsement. Every other Western European foreign volunteer formation was an initiative of local collaborationists and the German SS apparatus. The Frikorps Danmark carried, however hedged and however reluctant, a degree of sanction from its home government that no other formation could claim. That distinction made it uniquely difficult to condemn cleanly after the war, and the Danish state's handling of that difficulty was not always honest. 12,000 men responded to the initial call. Half were rejected. About 1,000 formed the first contingent, which departed for Hamburg in mid-July 1941. A second battalion was assembled through August from further recruits, including approximately 100 Danes extracted from the SS Nordland Regiment. By the end of 1941, the Frikorps had a strength of approximately 1,160 men. Across the full course of its existence, roughly 6,000 Danes served in its ranks. 77 of those were officers of the Royal Danish Army. The pre-war Danish army had numbered 6,600 men in total. The demographic profile of those who came forward was examined systematically in the landmark 1998 study conducted by historians Claus Bundgaard Christensen, Niels Bo Poulsen and Peter Scharf Smith. Their conclusion was that the average Frikorps recruit was either a DNSAP member or a member of the German minority in southern Jutland, and that the social range of those recruits was genuinely broad, from officers and professionals to workers and tradesmen. Approximately 1,500 of the total Danish volunteers who served in various German formations across the war came from the German-speaking minority in Jutland. men whose community identity was already oriented toward Germany in ways that made SS service a natural extension of existing allegiances. Beyond this core, the anti-communist motivation operated as a genuine independent recruiting force reaching men who had no prior DNSAP involvement, but who found the crusade framing of the Eastern War compelling enough to act on it. The recruits who arrived at Langenhorn Barracks near Hamburg in late July 1941 entered standard Waffen-SS training. Physically brutal, ideologically systematic, designed to produce soldiers who understood themselves as members of an elite ideological formation rather than simply effective fighters. They were issued SS uniforms with a cuff band reading Frikorps Danmark on the lower left sleeve and a small Danish national shield above it in the national colours, red with a white cross. SS collar insignia were worn by all ranks. The symbolism was visible and deliberate. These men were soldiers of the SS. Whatever they had told themselves about why they were there, they were now wearing its uniform and training under its methods. Training was completed by September and the corps was transferred to Owinska in occupied Poland, called Treschow in German administrative usage, where it continued preparation through the autumn and winter of 1941 and into 1942. During these months, the first command crisis arrived, and it illuminates something important about the nature of the institution these men had joined. The Frikorps' first commander was Lieutenant Colonel Christian Peder Crissing. He was an artillery officer of the Royal Danish Army, a professional soldier with genuine credentials and a committed anti-communist who had come to the position through the Danish Army's accommodation framework. The point deserves emphasis. Crissing was not a DNSAP member, he was not a National Socialist. He held no particular ideological attachment to the SS project beyond his anti-communism, which was real enough, but which represented only one dimension of what the SS required from the men who led its formations. He was a professional soldier who had decided that the war against the Soviet Union was a legitimate cause worth fighting and who had accepted a command that the Danish army's accommodation with the occupation had made available to him. Himmler had Crissing dismissed in February 1942. The stated reason was insufficient ideological adherence to National Socialism, not military incompetence, not personal misconduct, insufficient ideology. The SS did not simply need competent soldiers to lead its foreign volunteer formations, it needed men who understood that an SS unit was not merely a military organisation, but the embodiment and instrument of an ideological project. Crissing was not that man, and both parties had always known it. He was transferred back to the Danish Army's artillery arm, rose through its ranks over the subsequent years, and ended his career as a general. He was not prosecuted after liberation. His successor was a different kind of man in almost every respect. Christian Friedrich von Schalburg was born on the 15th of April 1906 in Smainogorsk, in the Tomsk region of the Russian Empire, in what is now the Altai Krai of Russia. His father was Danish, born in Nyborg. His mother, Elena Vasilyevna, came from a Russian noble family. The biographical origin matters because it determined everything about the ideological formation of the man who would command Denmark's SS volunteers into their first battle and die in it. Von Schalburg grew up in Russia. He received a military education in the Tsar's Cadet Corps, one of those institutions of imperial Russian aristocratic life that existed in a world organised entirely around hierarchy, service, and the certainty that the order it served was permanent. He was 11 years old when the Bolshevik Revolution began in October 1917. He was old enough to understand what he was watching. His family fled westward toward Denmark through a Russia that was dismantling itself in violence and ideological terror. He arrived in Copenhagen carrying the destruction of his entire formative world as his foundational political experience. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is the explanation for everything that followed. The hatred of Bolshevism that shaped every decision von Schalburg made from the time he was capable of making political decisions was not constructed ideology absorbed from pamphlets and party meetings. It was lived experience. It had a specific face, a specific winter, specific sounds and images from a childhood shattered by a revolution that had taken his world and replaced it with something that, in his understanding, was the enemy of everything civilization had built. When the SS told its Western European recruits that Barbarossa was a crusade against Asiatic Bolshevism, it was telling most of them a story. For von Schalburg, it was telling him the continuation of a story that had begun in his childhood and to which he had been waiting for decades to write an ending. He joined the Danish army in 1929 and served in the Royal Life Guards. His military record was consistently contradictory. He was described by various superiors as personally magnetic and capable of inspiring genuine loyalty in the men who served under him. He was also described in official assessments as unstable, and in one remarkable formulation that appears in the available documentation, as potentially a dangerous man for the army. He wrote a letter to the king defending himself against what he characterized as Jewish slander from within the officer corps. By 1939, his political commitments were fully public. He had taken over the leadership of the NSU, the DNSAP's youth wing, and was running it with the combination of personal charisma and ideological intensity that such a role required. Young men found him compelling. Older officers found him alarming. Both reactions were probably accurate assessments of the same qualities. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, before Denmark's occupation and before the larger political context had placed any particular pressure on any Danish citizen to make a decisive choice, von Schalburg led a group of NSU volunteers to Finland to fight in the winter war against the Soviet Union. He called them Blodringerne, the Blood Boys. The formulation reveals something about how he understood the ideological stakes of what they were doing. This was not simply an anti-communist intervention in a neighbouring country's war. It was a blood commitment, a willing participation in violence in the service of a cause that he understood as existential. He had fired before the gun went off. Whatever pressure the subsequent occupation and the subsequent recruitment apparatus created, von Schalburg had already shown that he did not need external pressure to make the choice. After the occupation, he was permitted by the king and the Danish army to attach himself to the 5th SS Division Viking as a Hauptsturmführer. He fought in Barbarossa's opening months on the divisional staff and earned the Iron Cross 1st and 2nd class. In February 1941, months before the Frikorps was publicly announced, von Schalburg had already proposed to Fritz Clausen the creation of a Danish SS unit to be called Regiment Dannebrog, to be commanded by himself. He had been thinking about this before anyone asked him to. He arrived at the Frikorps training base in Treschow on the 27th of February 1942 and assumed command on the 1st of March, now ranked as SS Sturmbannführer. What he found was a formation that had been held in extended training for months, that had survived its first commander's ideologically motivated dismissal, and that was ready in a purely military sense for combat that its organisational sponsors had not yet committed it to. He moved immediately. Daily duty hours were extended from 5 in the morning to 8 at night. He introduced systematic instruction in German and Russian. He introduced 30 minutes of physical training every morning without exception. He brought ideological instruction up to the level that the SS required, and conducted it himself in sessions that by all accounts his men found significantly more compelling than any previous political education they had received. The SS had given him command because of his political reliability and his relationship with subordinates. Both qualities were genuine. Men who served under von Schalburg left accounts that consistently described him as a commander who was worth following into difficult places. Whether that quality of leadership mitigated or aggravated the harm his command produced is a question this documentary cannot and will not resolve on the viewer's behalf. On the 8th of May 1942, von Schalburg was flown by Junkers Ju-52 with the first elements of the Frikorps into the Demyansk pocket. The campaign they had been preparing for since the previous summer had finally found them. The Demyansk pocket had been forming since January. Soviet forces of the Northwestern Front had driven through the German lines in conditions of extreme winter cold and had encircled approximately 95,000 German soldiers of the 2nd Army Corps in the area around Demyansk, south of Lake Ilmen and east of Staraya Russa, in the forest and swamp country of northwestern Russia. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. The pocket would be held, supplied by air, and relieved by a ground counterattack. For the first time in the history of warfare, an entire army was to be sustained entirely by airlift for an extended period. The Luftwaffe devoted nearly everything available in the northern sector to this task. Transport aircraft flew 33,000 sorties into the Demyansk area over the course of the operation. 64,000 tons of supplies went in, 35,000 wounded were evacuated. It worked at enormous and ultimately catastrophic cost to Germany's transport aviation capacity, and the apparent success of the Demyansk airlift would become one of the central arguments used by Göring to convince Hitler that the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad could be similarly sustained. That analogy was false, The scales were incomparable, but the lesson that senior German decision-makers drew from Demyansk was one of the factors that condemned 300,000 men in a city 400 kilometers to the south. The Demyansk pocket, by surviving, helped kill the Sixth Army. History produces these ironies without apology. A ground corridor into the pocket, the Ramushevo corridor, had been established by late April 1942. It was 4 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It crossed flooded forest and waterlogged marsh through which movement was barely possible even before Soviet artillery was directed at it. The Soviets attacked it constantly, and with full understanding of its strategic importance. The corridor was the only overland connection between the trapped garrison and the German rear. Cut it, and the pocket was sealed again. Hold it, and 95,000 men survived to continue holding ground that Hitler had decided was strategically indispensable. This was the tactical problem handed to the Frikorps Danmark when it flew in on the 8th of May. They were attached to the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf and took up positions along the Robia River with orders to prevent Soviet forces from expanding a bridgehead they had established on the western bank. Nothing that any of these men had experienced in Denmark or in Hamburg or in the forests of occupied Poland prepared them for what they found. The terrain around Demyansk was dense northern Russian forest, trackless, waterlogged in the spring thaw, cut through with rivers and streams that flooded their banks in May, and turned the ground between the tree lines into something that was neither solid earth nor navigable water. Movement off the few existing tracks required struggling through bog that could take a man to the waist. Artillery observation was degraded by the tree cover. Resupply was irregular and dangerous. Medical evacuation of the wounded across difficult terrain under fire was a challenge that cost additional casualties with every attempt. The temperature in May and June ran to 30 degrees. The mosquitoes in the Demyansk swamps were severe enough to be recorded in multiple letters home alongside the artillery fire. Both were constant. Both were something you eventually stopped processing as information and simply endured as the permanent condition of existence. The Frikorps received its first combat on the 20th of May, when it was committed against a Soviet attack along the supply corridor. 2 dead, 3 wounded. A modest accounting by what was coming. Through May, the Corps lost 20 dead and a significant number of wounded. Then, on the 2nd of June, von Schalburg ordered the Frikorps' first major offensive operation. The Corps had been given a role in a larger German effort to push the front line northward and establish more defensible positions in the Demyansk area. The operation was codenamed Danebrog after the Danish flag. The Frikorps' specific assignment was the capture of the settlement of Bolshevism Dubovici. The assault companies went forward at dawn, supported by German artillery, across ground that proved more heavily flooded and more strongly defended than the planning had indicated. Companies struggled through chest-deep water in places under fire from positions they could not always clearly identify. The attack faltered. Von Schalburg went forward, against the explicit advice of a company commander who told him directly that the front line was no place for a corps commander. Von Schalburg moved toward the sound of the fighting. He stepped on a mine. The explosion critically wounded him. A Soviet artillery shell struck seconds later. He was dead before he could be evacuated. The men sent to recover his body found a leg torn off at the hip and a foot missing. He was 36 years old. He had commanded the Frikorps for 93 days. The attack on the 2nd of June cost the formation 21 dead and 58 wounded in a single day. Among the dead was the man who had built it. On the 3rd of June, von Schalburg's coffin was draped in the Danebrog and carried to the Corps cemetery in the village of Byakovo in the Demyansk area. SS Brigadeführer Helmuth Becker of the Totenkopf Division spoke at the graveside. That same day, Heinrich Himmler promoted von Schalburg posthumously to SS Obersturmbannführer, making the promotion retroactive to the 1st of June. In Copenhagen, Vaderlandet filled its front page with the news. A memorial service organised in Denmark was disrupted by a student shouting protests from the back of the room. The poet Valdemar Rørdam, who had already caused public scandal with a poem praising Hitler, published a tribute to the fallen commander that completed the destruction of whatever remained of his literary reputation. The country was not mourning, the country was watching, and what Denmark thought about the men it had permitted to go east was becoming clearer every week that the Eastern Front continued to produce Danish dead. Letters written by Danish volunteers in the days immediately following von Schalburg's death document, something that this documentary will not minimise. Multiple accounts from within the formation record that in the period after the 2nd of June, the Frikorps took no prisoners. The precise scope and duration of this practice is not established from external sources. The record is based on the volunteers' own correspondence rather than independent verification. What can be stated with confidence is that the men themselves wrote it down. They recorded it in letters home. That detail exists in the record, and it will not be removed from this account because it complicates the Crusader narrative. History is not obligated to protect any narrative from its own evidence. The Germans appointed a replacement for von Schallberg within days. His name was Hans Albert von Lettow-Vorbeck, an SS Obersturmbannführer who had served in the Wiking Division and who had been redirected from a posting to SS Legion Flanders. He arrived on the 9th of June. He was briefed on the operation scheduled for the following morning. He led his new command into action on the 11th of June. He was killed the same day. 2 commanders dead in 9 days. The Frikorps had now burned through its original commanding officer, his replacement, and his replacement's replacement in 4 months. The Danish officer Knud Berger Martinsen took command. Martinsen was born on the 30th of November 1905 in Sandved, the son of a tailor. He became a soldier in 1928 and spent the following 12 years building what appeared to be a solid professional military career. By April 1940, he was attending the General Staff course at Frederiksberg Palace, which meant he was being considered for the senior positions that a man of his record could reasonably expect. The German occupation ended that prospect, not by making advancement impossible in any technical sense, but by making the framework within which advancement meant something collapse from underneath him. He joined the DNSAP 17 days after the occupation began. He then participated in public political demonstrations while still wearing his Danish army uniform, which his superiors duly recorded in his file. His regular military career was over, he resigned and went east, and by the summer of 1942 he was the most senior surviving Danish officer in a formation that had lost everyone above him. He would command the Frikorps for the remainder of its existence. He was a professional soldier of genuine competence operating in conditions of sustained attrition that ground down competent soldiers as efficiently as it ground down everyone else. The summer of 1942 at Demyansk was a destruction that reduced the Frikorps to a shadow of what had arrived in May. Soviet attacks on the Ramushevo corridor came week after week, pressed home regardless of cost. The Danish companies holding their sectors held them at costs that climbed through June and into July. The 16th of July was the worst single day. The Danish soldiers at the front were waiting for hot food to come forward from the field kitchens behind the lines. Before the food could be delivered, the Soviet artillery barrage began. It was described by survivors as exceptional even by the standards of a front where exceptional artillery was not exceptional. The attack that followed was sustained and pressed home, with the indifference to casualty figures that characterized Soviet offensive operations in this period. Men who had been waiting for their dinner were dead before it arrived. Others fought through the afternoon and into the evening against infantry attacks that the artillery had been intended to prepare, but that came regardless of whether the preparation had worked. By early August, the Frikorps had lost more than 300 dead. Of the original force that had flown into Demyansk in May, approximately 150 men remained in the line. 2 weak companies. General von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt wrote to thank them, acknowledging their bravery and their fidelity to the oath they had taken. He stated that they had always shown the greatest bravery and readiness to make sacrifices. The general was not wrong. What he did not address was what any of it had achieved beyond keeping a 4-kilometer corridor open for another week. The corridor had been held. The pocket remained. The Demyansk salient would itself be abandoned less than a year later when German forces evacuated it in February 1943. The ground these men died for was given up anyway. The Frikorps was withdrawn and sent to Denmark to reconstitute in early August. The homecoming was not what the recruitment posters had suggested it would be. Danish historian Bo Lidegaard later described the relationship between the Danish civilian population and the returning Frikorps men as freezing cold. Legionnaires on leave in Danish cities and towns encountered hostility that ranged from deliberate avoidance to open physical confrontation. Street fights between returning volunteers and Danish civilians were documented in multiple cities. The men who had gone east in the summer of 1941 with various combinations of ideological conviction, professional frustration, genuine anti-communism, and personal courage had come home to a country that had drawn its own conclusions. Whatever private complexity some Danish observers may have felt about the governmental semi-endorsement that had permitted the Frikorps to exist, the street-level verdict was simpler and was expressed physically. The question this homecoming raises is not comfortable. The Danish government had authorized these men to go. It had sent representatives to their departure ceremony. It had protected their pension rights. When the same men returned gaunt and depleted from Russian swamps and were met with civilian fists, did those civilians understand that their own government had enabled what they were now condemning? Was the endorsement always intended as temporary, as something convenient during the occupation and prosecutable after liberation? Or was the government genuinely managing a situation it could not control, and hoping the consequences would be manageable? The Danish state has never given a fully honest answer to that question. The men who were prosecuted after the war were not given the opportunity to press it. The Corps returned to the Eastern Front in October 1942, rebuilt with replacements and confirmed under Martinson's permanent command. On the 13th of November it was deployed to Jelgava in Latvia, originally intended for anti-partisan operations behind the lines. The strategic situation in the northern sector did not allow for extended recovery. In late November 1942, Soviet forces of the Kalinin Front encircled the German garrison in Velikie Luki, a fortified city on the boundary between army groups north and centre. The garrison was ordered by Hitler to hold at all costs and await a relief force. The city fell into Soviet encirclement on the 27th of November. German commanders at every level understood what the encirclement meant, having watched Stalingrad develop through the same weeks into the same pattern. The Germans called it the Little Stalingrad of the North. The description was accurate in everything except scale. The Frikorps Danmark was committed to the relief effort in December 1942, fighting alongside the 1st SS Infantry Brigade, in conditions of Russian winter that made movement across the frozen ground desperately difficult and made holding positions against Soviet assault even more so. The relief force attacked repeatedly through December, fighting through stubborn Soviet defensive positions organised specifically to intercept any attempt to reach the encircled city. German spearheads in early January closed to within 8 kilometres of Velikie Luki before Soviet pressure on their flanks halted them. The garrison surrendered on the 16th of January 1943. Approximately 150 men broke out the night before the surrender and reached German lines. The rest went into Soviet captivity, from which most did not return. The Frikorps had fought for weeks to reach men it never reached. The Corps was withdrawn from the front line in April 1943 and sent to Grafenwöhr in Bavaria. The decision to disband it had already been made. The Waffen-SS's organisational logic in 1943 was moving toward larger, German-controlled divisional structures that would absorb the National Volunteer Legions and integrate their manpower into formations under direct SS command. The National Legions had served their propaganda purpose in the early years of the war. Now the manpower they had generated was needed in formations that the SS could deploy flexibly and control absolutely. The Frikorps Danmark was formally disbanded on the 6th of May 1943. Most of its surviving personnel were transferred to SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 24 Denmark and absorbed into the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, which would go on to fight some of the most intense defensive battles of the war's final years, including Narva in 1944 and the collapse in Pomerania in 1945. The men had volunteered for a Danish formation. They finished the war as components of a German division. Whether they understood in the summer of 1941 that this was the likely trajectory of what they were joining is a question the available letters and testimonies do not answer consistently. Some knew. Some convinced themselves otherwise, some never asked. The ones who never asked were perhaps the most honest about what the Frikorps had always actually been. Martinson returned to Denmark to command the Schalburg Corps, the paramilitary formation named after the dead commander, affiliated to the Germanic SS and operating inside Denmark. It was not a combat unit in the Demiansk sense. It operated in Danish cities and towns, and its activities included beatings, targeted violence, and the murder of Danish resistance figures and perceived political opponents. It drew heavily on former Frikorps men whose combat experience made them effective instruments of internal terror. Martinson commanded it until October 1944, when he was arrested by the Gestapo following internal SS disputes. He escaped, returned to Denmark, and was arrested by Danish authorities on the 5th of May 1945, the day of liberation. The post-war legal reckoning with men who had served in German formations was systematic. The special courts established under Danish law processed thousands of files in the years following liberation. For Frikorps veterans, the legal position at its core was clear. They were Danish citizens who had taken up arms in the service of an occupying power. The fact that the Danish home government had, in various forms and with various degrees of reluctance, permitted their departure and protected their pension rights did not change the legal analysis of what they had done, though it created a degree of moral complexity that the prosecution of these men was not always honest about. Martinson's case went further than standard collaboration prosecution. He was tried not only for his SS service and his role in the Schalburg Corps, but for murder. The specific charge that dominated his trial was the killing of a Schalburg Corps officer named Kurt von Eggers, whom Martinson believed had been conducting an affair with his wife. He shot von Eggers personally in 1944. The trial extended over nearly 4 years. At 1 in the morning on the 25th of June 1949, Knud Børge Martinsen was executed by a Danish firing squad in Copenhagen. He was 43 years old. The man who had commanded Denmark's SS volunteers from Demyansk through Veliky Luki died against a wall in the capital of the country he had served in an enemy's uniform. Crissing retired as a general. His brief command of the Frikorps appears in the record as a footnote in an otherwise unremarkable career. He was not prosecuted. The distinction between his ending and Martinson's is not only a matter of what each man did after Demyansk, it is also a matter of what each man was before the Frikorps. Crissing was a professional soldier who made a specific calculation in a specific moment, and then went back to his career when the calculation was superseded. Martinson had committed himself entirely and had no career to go back to, which left him with no option, except to keep going until someone stopped him. The families of the men who died at Demyansk and at Veliky Luki inhabited post-war Denmark without public acknowledgement of their loss. For the victims of German reprisals, it made no room for the families of men who had died in SS uniforms. The grief existed in kitchens and private rooms without recognition, without the social infrastructure that transforms individual bereavement into shared mourning. Von Schalburg's widow founded a memorial fund during the war that sent packages to Danish SS volunteers on the Eastern Front. After liberation, the memorial erected for him was destroyed. This is not an argument for the legitimacy of von Schalburg's choices or Martinson's. It is an observation about what happens to the human dimensions of historical catastrophe when a society decides it needs a clean narrative more than it needs a complete one. The historiography of the Frikorps Danmark has developed substantially since the immediate post-war years, when the dominant analytical framework treated these men as traitors whose motivations required little examination because the verdict on their conduct was obvious. The 1998 study by Christensen, Poulsen and Smith was a landmark in moving beyond that framework, introducing systematic demographic and motivational analysis that complicated the picture without rehabilitating the men being studied. Their work established that the Frikorps was not a formation of ideological zealots drawn exclusively from the DNSAP's fringe. It was a formation with a broad social base, a range of motivations, and a demographic profile that reflected specific patterns in Danish society during the occupation, rather than a simple tendency toward treasonous collaboration. Later scholarship has continued to probe both the motivations of the volunteers and the broader context of Danish society during the occupation, increasingly acknowledging something the immediate post-war narrative was not comfortable with. The Frikorps volunteer was the most visible and most easily condemned collaborator, the man who had put on a uniform and gone east with a weapon. But the administrative machinery that processed Danish agricultural exports to Germany had also served German interests. The Danish police assisted German operations before August 1943, when the Germans finally dissolved the accommodation and imposed direct occupation. The Danish civil service kept the state functioning in ways that freed German administrative resources for other purposes. The question of where to draw the line between accommodation and collaboration was a question Danish society drew in one place during the occupation and in a different place after liberation, and the men who paid the most severe legal consequences were those who had been most visible rather than necessarily those who had done the most damage. This is not an equivalence argument. It is not suggesting that the civil servant who processed agricultural export paperwork was morally equivalent to the man who carried an SS rifle at Demyansk. It is suggesting that the moral landscape of Danish society during the occupation was more complex and more uncomfortable than the post-war framework of clear traitors and clear victims preferred to acknowledge, and that serious historical inquiry is obligated to map that complexity even when the mapping produces conclusions that disrupt comfortable narratives. The specific question of anti-communist motivation deserves treatment that neither dismisses it as propaganda nor accepts it uncritically as justification. For a substantial portion of the Frikorps volunteers, anti-communism was a genuine primary driver. The Soviet Union that these men feared and hated was a real state that had carried out real mass atrocities. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture had killed millions through deliberate policy. The purges of 1937 and 1938 had murdered hundreds of thousands, including most of the Red Army's senior officer corps. For men like von Schalburg, whose formative experience had been watching the Bolshevik Revolution destroy his world, the anti-communist motivation was not abstract ideology. It was lived conviction rooted in lived experience. The problem is that fighting your genuine convictions against Bolshevism meant fighting inside the SS. And the SS was not simply a military organization with aggressive politics. It was the ideological enforcement arm of a regime that was, at the precise moment the Frikorps was fighting at Demyansk, industrially murdering the Jewish population of Europe. The Totenkopf division that the Frikorps was attached to bore the name of the same SS apparatus that administered the concentration camps. The institutional connections were not metaphorical, they were organizational and personnel links between the formations fighting in Russia and the formations administering mass murder in Poland and elsewhere. Men can hold genuine convictions and serve monstrous purposes. The sincerity of the conviction does not purify the purpose, and the monstrousness of the purpose does not invalidate the sincerity. Both exist simultaneously, and history is obligated to hold them simultaneously, rather than resolving the tension in either direction. The pan-Germanic motivation operated for other volunteers as a different kind of sincere belief. The idea that the Danes and the Germans and the other Northern European peoples constituted a single natural community temporarily divided by historical accidents was not an SS invention. It had roots in 19th century intellectual culture that extended well beyond fascism. For men who had absorbed this framework, serving in the SS was genuinely not experienced a service to a foreign power. The Danish courts found this argument inadmissible. They were correct. Denmark was a recognized sovereign state. Its citizens owed it legal loyalty, regardless of what ideological framework they had constructed. Treason is defined by conduct, not by the sincerity of the ideological system through which the traitor understood his conduct. But law and history are not the same discipline. History is obligated to ask how human beings construct meaning around their choices, and what those constructions reveal about the societies that produce them. Understanding the Frikorps volunteer requires that engagement. It requires asking what Denmark in 1940 and 1941 actually felt like, what it felt like to be a professional soldier in an army that had surrendered in 6 hours, and what kind of choice a man who had absorbed those specific experiences would make when someone told him there was a formation being raised to go east and fight the thing he had always believed was the greatest threat to everything he valued. The answer varies by individual. That is the honest answer. Some of these men were true believers who would have made the same choice in any circumstances. Some were products of a specific moment whose ideological commitment was real, but whose biographical trajectory would have been entirely different in a different political context. Some were opportunists who read the landscape and calculated wrong. Some were very young men who made choices in circumstances of political extremity that no political theory adequately prepared them for, and that the people judging them afterward had not themselves faced. None of this closes the question, none of it was intended to. We return finally to where this documentary began. Crusaders or Quislings? In the most straightforward legal and political sense, the men of the Frikorps Danmark were Quislings. They were Danish citizens who took up arms in the service of the power that had occupied their country. The Danish courts that tried them after the war were applying well-established law to conduct that was by any reasonable standard treasonous, and they were right to do so. The civilians who met them in Danish streets with fists were expressing a moral judgment that most of Denmark shared, and that was, at its core, accurate. They were also, in the limited sense that the word can be applied to men serving a criminal system, crusaders. They went east believing something. Most of them believed it genuinely, not as cover for personal advantage, not as rationalization for conduct they privately knew to be wrong. They believed that Bolshevism was the genuine enemy of European civilization, and that fighting it was a legitimate act regardless of what uniform the fight required them to wear. The anti-communist conviction was real, the pan-Germanic conviction was real for those who held it. Von Schallberg had spent 30 years building toward the moment he was flown into Demyansk. That is not the biography of a man performing conviction he did not feel. The coexistence of those two descriptions is the problem that this documentary has not resolved, because it cannot be resolved by selecting one label and discarding the other without losing something true. They were Danish citizens who committed treason. They were men who believed they were fighting for something real. They were soldiers who bled and died in large numbers in conditions of extreme violence for a cause that history has since condemned without reservation. They were the men their own government enabled and then prosecuted. They were the men whose families grieved in private for 50 years because the country had decided what they were and had no room for any other account of them.